Hi there, Rob Poyton here from the Innsmouth Book Club on another Innsmouth excursion, and I'm somewhat further abroad this time from my usual haunts around Bedford. Behind me you see Lake Geneva. Yes, I'm on the Lake Geneva shoreline. I'm sure you all know the riff that goes along with that, but I'm not at Montreux, I'm at the other end at Geneva. I'm here to do a workshop actually, and as usual when I go travelling anywhere I like to look up any local myths, local legends, local hauntings to get a Innsmouth excursion from. And to be honest with Geneva, I was struggling a little bit. I couldn't really find any particular local hauntings or stories or anything like that. And then of course the realisation hit me that in 1816 this was the source of the creation of two of the most iconic characters in weird fiction. Now, 1816 was already a very interesting year, a very tragic year in many ways, because it was known as the year without summer. This was because of the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which put up so much ash into the atmosphere that the world was effectively plunged into darkness. Global temperatures dropped by 3 degrees. This of course caused problems with farming. There were food shortages and many other sort of bad things that happened. But one, I suppose, positive thing that came out to it was the results of a trip to the house just behind us, which we'll look at in a moment, the Villa Diodati, which was of course for a short time the residence of Mary Shelley, her husband-to-be Percy Shelley, Lord Byron and Dr. Polidori. So Mary and Percy had come in for a break in June. Also with them was Mary's sister-in-law Claire Claremont, who was at one time a lover of Lord Byron. And Byron turned up in typical style in a Napoleonic carriage, fresh from a tour of the battlefield at Waterloo, and he had with him his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori. Now the weather of course was awful. They had to abandon any plans to go boating on the lake or anything like that. So Byron rented the villa, which they all moved into for several days, and they couldn't go out. There were storms raging on the lake, thunder and lightning, and it was that setting by candlelight one night that they decided to each write a ghost story. This was the first time Shelley and Byron had met. Of course, Claire Claremont, as we said, was a former lover of Byron, and Polidori, it seemed, was quite taken with Mary, so there was definitely an element of sexual tension going on in the villa. Some also speculate about the use of opium as well, which, let's face it, wouldn't be out of character. So, by all accounts, two things prompted this idea of writing the ghost story. One was the talk of galvanism, which was a big thing in science at the time. And I guess that idea, coupled with the lightning storms that were going on, perhaps sparked, if you'll excuse the pun, this notion of bringing life through the use of electricity. Alongside that, the group had also been reading a collection of German horror stories known as the Phantasmagoriana. So a collection of those horror stories allied with this idea of science obviously was a big prompt for Shelley's creation. So you can picture the scene with the flickering candlelight, the thunder and lightning going on outside, these stories being read. Also other things was read as well. There was in particular a poem by Coleridge called Christabel. Byron read this out very dramatically, I imagine, which led to Shelley fleeing the room screaming. And he later claims to have had a vision of a woman with eyes where her nipples should have been. That particular vision was later used by Polidori in his story. So they each agreed to write a story. Byron wrote a poem called Darkness. Mary, of course, wrote what was to be the basis of Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, which she said also largely came from a nightmare she had that night. She actually references this in the preface to the 1831 edition. So Polidori is an interesting character as well. Born in London, he was Byron's personal physician. But he was also commissioned by Byron's publishers to follow Byron in his trips around Europe and write a journal about them. Byron was very dismissive of this, it seems, and of Polidori in general, so the relationship didn't go too well. Polidori, it seems, was more infatuated with Byron, and there's a lot of speculation about the exact nature of that relationship. And it's interesting to note that after Polidori's death, which many people say was suicide at the age, I think, 25 or 26, Polidori's sister actually seized a lot of the journals, tore a lot of the pages out, heavily edited them before they were published, and in fact ended up burning the originals to expunge what she described as the sinful sections. But Polidori, of course, from what Byron started writing that night, created his own novel and his own character, Lord Ruthven, and the book was called The Vampire. Now, the interesting thing with this is prior to that, the vampire was a folklorish creature, quite a hideous thing. And what Ruthven does is take that monster of folklore and turn him into this suave, noble English aristocrat, which of course many people say was modelled on Lord Byron himself. So here we see that pivotal change of the vampire from this foul creature into a sophisticated predator. That, of course, set the tone for Bram Stoker's Dracula later on. And in fact, there were a whole raft of vampire stories that came out at that time. People like Gogol, Dumas, Tolstoy all wrote vampire stories after the release of Polidori's novel. And there were adaptations for stage and all sorts of things. So it was a very successful work. And I think it really set the tone for what we regard as the modern vampire, or the modern gothic vampire. So in one sense, we can see perhaps the seeds of modern horror, the birth of modern horror in those events. We can't really describe it as the birth of the Gothic, because The Castle of Otranto was published in 1764, widely regarded as the first Gothic novel. There were things like Lewis's Monk in 1796, Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Udolpho in 1794. So we can think of this as the second wave of Gothic, but nonetheless extremely important in the development of the modern horror or the modern Gothic story. And I think what we really get with Shelley is that addition of the scientific angle. I mean, people might even argue whether Frankenstein is a horror story or a sci-fi, or perhaps even a religious story in some sense. But nonetheless, she seems to have been the first to combine those two elements together. So as far as that night goes, there's been a couple of adaptations as well. Ken Russell made a film in 1986 called Gothic, recounting the events of that night in typical glorious Ken Russell style. And in 2020, there was a Doctor Who episode as well called The Hauntings of Villa Diodati, which again was set at that time and place with all those characters, with the addition of a Cyberman somehow. I've not seen it, so I'm not sure quite how a Cyberman fits in there, but I'm sure that's an interesting one to watch as well. Now, I've also been reliably informed by my friend here, Michael, that Frankenstein's monster makes his first killing in this place as well, in Geneva. And in fact, there is now a statue of the monster in the town square. So that's what we're going to go and have a look at next. So this is the Plain Palais in Geneva, and this was the site of the Frankenstein monster's first murder. And as you can see, we've got this quite remarkable statue here behind me. It really is, an ugly thing, but in a good way. It's incredibly detailed. So I was just discussing with Michael, we're not sure exactly how this would have looked back in Mary Shelley's time, but we think this would have been a large plain. And Michael was saying this is where the French army were stationed their troops when they were here fighting the Swiss. So a lot of history, but that really is quite a remarkable statue. Can you see the likeness? So I hope you've enjoyed that excursion today. It's a little further afield, but a very interesting place. It's very difficult to get into the actual villa now. It's private property. You can't actually get in, which is a great shame. It would be a great place to visit and go inside. But nonetheless, very interesting spot and a very interesting moment in weird fiction history. As always, please do check out our podcasts, the Innsmouth Book Club and Strange Shadows, where we cover all aspects of weird fiction and film, and also we're working through the weird stories of Clark Ashton Smith. Also, please do take a look at the event we've got coming up this September in the UK, the Innsmouth Literary Festival, We've got a great collection of guests coming along. We've got guest of honour Ramsey Campbell will be appearing live on Zoom. There's going to be traders, there's going to be gaming opportunities. So that's turning out to be a really excellent Lovecraftian event, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, take care. Uh, 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 uh.